I've shot several different firearms ranging from dirt cheap Saturday night specials like the Cobra FS 380 that cost just shy of $100 all the way to more expensive purpose-built specialty tools like the FNX 45 Tactical. I've shot my fair share of good and not so good firearms, so many of them in fact that I've lost track. Of the not so good, there's this one model I hated shooting the most, the Taurus PT 24/7 in 9mm. Today, I'd like to talk about it. Now I know some of you don't like it when anyone talks crap about Taurus. Before we get to the topic, let me get just one thing out of the way. I don't hate Taurus. As a matter of fact, like most of you, I love what they as a company represent. Value for the money. I'm the type who likes budget-oriented stuff, be it electronic devices, cars, clothes, shoes, or anything in between. I currently own a Taurus Tracker in .44 Magnum and find it to be the best bang-for-the-buck big-bore revolver on the market, even with its ugly ribber grip. It's built like a tank, highly reliable, sufficiently accurate out to about 100 yards, and best of all, it didn't cost an arm and a leg. I only had to pay an out-the-door price of $450 for it. So just to reiterate, I don't hate Taurus, or any firearms company for that matter. And I'm not a fanboy of any firearms company either. Whether I like or hate any kind of consumer product solely depends on the value I get for the price I pay. And now that that's out of the way, let's talk about why the Taurus PT 24/7 is the gun I hated shooting the most. Let me start by saying that the Taurus PT 24/7 is not without its good points. For one thing, its OSS version was Taurus's entry to the United States Special Operations Command Joint Combat Pistol Program in 2005. It competed with other firearms companies' entries, big names like FN's FNP 45 USG, Ruger's P345, Para Ordnance's LDA 1911, Smith & Wesson's M&P, Sig Sauer's P220 Combat, Heckler & Koch's HK45C, Glock's G21SF, and HS Products' HS45, which Springfield Armory later marketed to civilians as the Springfield XD. The USSOCOM Joint Combat Pistol Program ultimately got scrapped in 2006, but it ushered in a new age of combat pistols that set the very high standards most full-size tactical handgun models on the civilian market that we know of are measured by today. As there was no way Taurus's entry was going to win, the company decided to offer it along with many of its other handgun models to civilians. Because of all its features and its significantly wallet-friendly price point, the PT 24/7 OSS gathered a lot of attention, making it highly popular to the point that it won the National Rifle Association's Handgun of the Year award the same year it was introduced. What made the Taurus PT 24/7 appealing to me was the fact that it was on sale at my local gun store for $350, and that it was a striker-fired handgun with a double-action, single-action trigger, which I'll talk more about later. It also had a 3-position safety lever, which doubled as a decocker, something that was practically unheard of, especially considering the price I was getting it for. At the time, the only other handgun I knew that had this feature was the Walther P99, and it was around $200 more expensive. I remember the particular PT 24/7 I received had a pretty good fit and finish. In fact, if it weren't for the very few little rough edges on the trigger and backstrap, it would give pistols that cost double its price a run for their money, but only if we're talking about fit and finish. The rough edges totally disappeared when I gave them a few gentle swipes of 1000 grit sandpaper. On the top of the slide, just a little behind the ejection port, there was a bit of faded discoloration, but it looked so faint that I didn't make a big deal of it. There was also the action of the slide on the frame rails, which I remember was a bit grittier than I would have liked. Some of the Taurus PT 24/7's good points include its superb ergonomics. To me, it felt like it was a little slimmer and just a tad bit shorter than a Glock 21, but the grip was a little longer because of the extended base plate of its magazine. The handgun pointed naturally and had good balance. I remember the thin grip had a little palm swell which made it comfortable. It felt really good in the hands. It also had nice checkering for a tighter purchase on the grip, which allowed for better recoil control. I don't remember having a problem with the gun's recoil because of the size and shape of the grip and its checkering. Whenever the gun functioned without FTFs and FTEs, I remember I could shoot relatively accurate double taps too without much effort, thanks to its ergonomics and its trigger, which was pretty good when it worked. Speaking of the trigger, As I mentioned earlier, my PT-24-7 had a double-action single-action trigger, but it was different than most handguns with a double-action single-action trigger, as those are typically hammer-fired, while the PT-24-7 was striker-fired. In general, hammer-fired handguns are larger, heavier, a bit more complicated to work with, and just a little more expensive than striker-fired handguns because they have more moving parts. They're more expensive and take longer to build. Striker-fired handguns are usually simpler to work with and have fewer moving parts. They're faster and cheaper to build, and they can be built on smaller and lighter frames. As a handgun with a double-action, single-action trigger, the Taurus PT-24-7 could be cocked and decocked using its external safety that doubled as a decocker. When decocked, the trigger had a heavy double-action pull that cocked and released the striker for the initial shot. The trigger would then switch to a light single-action pull for all subsequent shots. If the cartridge in the chamber had a hard primer and wouldn't go off, the trigger could just be pulled again to try and ignite the primer. Handguns with this feature are usually marketed as having a double strike capability. But that decocker was where all the problems started for me. The day I brought my Taurus PT-24-7 to the range to break it in, after emptying a whole box of 124 grain Armscore 9mm full metal jacket ammo, I engaged the decocker with the chamber loaded and the gun went off. It scared the living daylights out of me. Good thing I was pointing it downrange and not at myself or anyone when that happened. I remember that I was still a little shaken when I tried to decock the handgun with the chamber loaded to see if the handgun would fire, and it did it again, and again, and again. That was 4 times in a row that it went off with the decocker. I assumed it probably wasn't decocking the striker, but instead was releasing it with full force, which made it work as if it was a second trigger. I called Taurus that same day. The representative I talked to was nice, but evidently knew nothing about firearms because when I described the problem I was having, she didn't sound like she understood a thing that I said. She only emailed me a label and gave instructions on how to ship the handgun back to them, which I did. Afterward, I got another email saying I would have to wait 5 to 7 weeks before my PT-24-7 could be repaired. So I waited. 6 weeks in, I got a call saying my handgun couldn't be repaired, but they would send me a replacement, which is the exact same model and finish. I hurriedly took it to the range and was pleased to find that it didn't have the decocker issue I had with the first one. I shot a total of 200 rounds of Armscore 124 grain 9mm ball ammo that day without problems, and went home happy. I thought I was all set until a couple of weeks later, after I shot another 300 rounds of Armscore 124 grain ball ammo in it. I thought it was sufficiently broken in, so I tried loading it with my actual carry ammo, 124 grain Federal Hydra Shock. The gun had been 100% reliable up to that point, as I had never loaded it with anything other than 124 grain Armscore 9mm ball ammo. I didn't know things would turn for the worst after the 500 round count. My PT-24-7 would not reliably feed the 124 grain Federal Hydra Shock reliably. A bullet would get jammed between the feed ramp and the slide's breech face every 2 or 3 shots. I assumed it had something to do with the barrel having a very steep feed ramp. I tried to polish it, but the problem persisted. After spending countless hours of research on the subject, I finally got to the realization that the handgun, being it was only designed for ball ammo, will almost always have problems with hollow points. I settled for what I remember was the only brand of defensive ammo that reliably fed 100% of the time, the Hornady XTP 124 grain. I thought I had everything figured out, and all was good for a while. I liked the PT-24-7 so much. It felt good in the hands, accuracy was more than acceptable, and it was easy to carry concealed. It wasn't long before I formed an attachment to it. Less than a year after I got the replacement, I started having problems again. All of a sudden, it decided that it didn't want to eject some of the same ammo I used to break it in, the 124 grain Armscore 9mm ball ammo. I cleaned the handgun whenever I got home from the range, so that couldn't have been the problem. I don't shoot with a limp wrist either. Since I couldn't figure out what caused the FTEs, I decided to buy a box of Winchester White Box ball ammo. All the empty brass cycled flawlessly. There was not a single stovepipe. All was good, until I had shot around 5 boxes or so. Again, all of a sudden, the gun decided to just break itself. This time, the recoil guide rod flew right out of the gun from the hole on the slide. No big deal, I thought. I only had to field strip the handgun and reinstall the guide rod, but it apparently caused another problem with the locking area, where the barrel would actually lock up with the slide. After reassembly, it worked okay for a little while, but the barrel disconnected from the slide and eventually started locking up. The handgun started having feeding issues again. So I called Taurus a second time. They emailed me another shipping label, I sent the gun back to them, and after 8 weeks I got the gun back with a new barrel, a new slide, and a new guide rod installed. I anxiously took it to the range to see if the feeding problems were fixed. And they were fixed. But there was a new problem. I wasn't hitting anything I aimed at. I inspected the new barrel and guide rod. Both looked good. But the new slide had machine marks in certain sections of it. It didn't look anywhere near as polished as the old slide. It looked like it was machined by someone who didn't know what he was doing. Could be a new employee. I took my PT 24/7 to a gunsmith to see if the problems could be remediated quickly, as I didn't want to be without it for another 8 weeks. I was told that the part of the slide where the rear sight was, it looked like the dovetail was not properly machined, which was the whole reason why none of my shots landed anywhere near my point of aim. He filed the sights and zeroed them. Then he polished the parts of the slide with all the machine marks, and my PT 24/7 was in working order again. But that wasn't the end of it. One day, after my routine field stripping and cleaning of the handgun, as I was reassembling it, the slide catch spring somehow went out of timing and got caught in between the slide and frame. After what seemed like an eternity of trying, I was able to get that spring unstuck, but it was bent so bad that I couldn't put it back in place. Another hour had passed, and I still couldn't reassemble the handgun. I couldn't help but contemplate what made me buy this handgun in the first place. So far, it had caused me more trouble than it was worth. With all the frustration I felt at the time, I was about ready to dispose of it when I heard that little voice of reason in my head telling me to go to the gunsmith one more time, get it fixed, then sell it to whoever's willing to buy it and get a decent replacement. I went back to the gunsmith, and as he was repairing it, he asked me if I had heard about Taurus's recall, which at the time I hadn't. I hurriedly called Taurus to find out how I could get a refund. After receiving instructions in yet another email, I sent the gun back to them, and 2 months later I got a $200 check in the mail. I had had enough. I decided to save a bit more money and look for a Walther P99 on the used market. Luckily, I did find one selling for the same price as the PT 24/7 and with only around 500 rounds shot in it. I have never been so happy with a handgun purchase. This Walther P99 is never leaving my inside the waistband holster. And that's it for this video. If you want to talk about the gun you hated shooting the most, feel free to comment down below. If you find this video helpful or entertaining, like, share, and subscribe, and click on that bell icon so you won't miss out on future videos. And as always, thanks for watching.